introduction. It's really nice to speak to a methodological audience, so I'm looking forward to today's discussion. I will speak for about 40 minutes, maybe a little bit longer, and then I will leave the rest of the session open for questions. I see in the room people who have lots of experience and others who may not have as much experience in methodology and thinking through different methods and how they come together. I'll do my best to give you a broad overview. I'll start though with an apology, and that apology is that if you are expecting some definition or some essentialized version of decolonizing methodologies, you're probably going to be disappointed. I'm going to give you really just the key coordinates, a bird's eye view of some essential writings in the field and some things to think about. And I'll keep saying this, that, you know, I am very fond of thinking about methods not as a cookbook, recipe book, but generally as a way of looking at the world and getting information about the world from a particular political lens and a particular context at a particular time. So forgive me if you are looking for a definition, but I will try my best to give you some of the key characteristics of what's become known as decolonizing methodologies. So I'll spend a few minutes talking about decolonizing methodologies, what people have written about them, and some of the key pillars. I've tried my best to distill some key pillars of decolonizing methodologies. I'm going to give you 5 criticisms, and these are not necessarily my criticisms, but criticisms that others have made too, and I think are useful in thinking through this type of methodological approach. And I'll spend just a few minutes at the end talking about future applications and where we are going with decolonizing research. All right, I've included a very important book, Decolonizing Research, Indigenous Story Work as Methodology, written and edited by many very useful, by people who are very interested in decolonizing methodologies, and there's some very useful chapters. But I've included this 20% off because one of the really interesting things about decolonizing methodologies, especially as they are located in the academy, is that they are part of a knowledge economy. And in fact, many of these books written about decolonizing methodologies, critical methodologies, and indigenous methodologies actually cost an arm and a leg because they are situated in a system, a colonial matrix, as someone said the other day, that's very difficult to step outside of. So I'm not going to pretend that we can step outside of it, but this is really something that we do need to think about in terms of the systems that govern decolonizing methodologies. So are my slides changing?
We still seeing your outline page, Prof. Right. Oh, yes. Okay, it's moving now.
There we go. So what is or what are decolonizing methodologies? Let's go back to probably the most seminal work, and that was written in 1988 by Linda I always get that wrong, Linda Smith, in 1988. And the opening of the book really focuses on the idea that research, at least research framed by a colonial lens, is probably one of the dirtiest words in the indigenous world's vocabulary. And that's one of the more famous decolonizing methodology sayings, and it's something that's held true and been consistent from 1988 onwards. And of course, one of the starting points in that we do have to acknowledge is the bad of colonial research. We know that research has its roots in a number of areas, but I think close to home, really, colonialism and British colonialism, specifically in our part of the world. There were obviously earlier versions of colonialism, but certainly the imperial expansion and the expansion into the colonies played a major role in our particular context. And research, particularly those in universities and other research entities, reflect those colonial features and power imbalances. You don't need to look very far to get a glimpse of this. You just need to read a little bit. I have just reread a few, well, actually a few times I've read about the diary of Henry Francis Finn. I've put his picture up there to get a glimpse of what it was like in the early 1800s. And he was one of the more famous colonists in this country who brokered a deal with Shaka, at the time Shaka Zulu, and which led primarily to the formation of of colonial Natal. And it's really interesting and shocking sometimes to see what's been written about what was happening at the time and how the colonial expansion worked, but more importantly, how colonialism worked on so many different levels in terms of structures, systems, and also in terms of the mind and how people thought. So we can get data from a lot of places, sources of information from a lot of places. But one of the key issues in terms of, let's call it the bad colonial research, was that research was done on people, not with people. They were often framed within a Western colonial and imperialist world view. And of course, historically framed with the goal, quite explicit goal of colonial expansion, land appropriation, very, very important, and that still stays with us today, and economic domination in mind. And of course, there were also, given the political context of the time, research done for overtly dubious reasons. And of course, anyone who's done a course in research ethics would be reminded of these: the Tuskegee syphilis trials of thalidomide, all the apartheid literature that focused on IQ and cognitive function, etc., amongst marginalized groups. And again, we don't need to look far for research done for overtly dubious reasons. But of course, on the subtle level, there are also multiple exclusions, silences, disrespect, and extraction that often happens when researchers do work, particularly in communities that are marginalized and do not have a voice in many of the so-called development initiatives that impact their lives. There's also research where there's a very little or no social change whatsoever, where participants have little or no voice, where research is done in dominantly English, in context where language is an issue, and we just have to look at Decolonizing the Mind by Ngugi wa Thiong'o and the politics of language in African literature to get a sense of that. And of course, very importantly, how knowledge economies keep things the way they are. For any of you who've entered into the debate about publishing, article processing charges, and so forth, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And I'll pick that up in a few minutes' time. So what are decolonizing methodologies then? Well, decolonizing methodologies in a very simplistic way, very simplistically explained, would be set up to counter many of the bad research that goes on out there, and generally brings together transformative, indigenous, liberation, feminist, and critical methods to support decolonization research. Now, within here, you can draw on a number of different methods, and many methods many people have aligned themselves to decolonizing methodologies by using particular kinds of methods, and I'll just name a few here: photo voice, various kinds of visual methods, participatory methods, storytelling, autoethnography, body mapping, and so forth. And we are very fortunate in South Africa to have many good examples of methods that have been applied, specifically focusing on marginalized groups and countering the effects of, I guess, colonial infused methodologies. And the assumption then is that some research methodologies can support decolonization and decolonial research. But of course, and I've said right at the beginning, it's very difficult to pinpoint what decolonizing methodologies are. And nor, in my view anyway, nor should we be trying to pin them down, because very importantly, it is both a methodological and a political movement, in my view. It pops up at key historical moments and reminds us of the need to keep vigilant and keep an eye on what we're doing. And most importantly, it really counters or positions itself as largely unhappy with Western knowledge production. Decolonizing methodologies generally try to disrupt universal ideas about the human condition. Importantly, is inclusive of marginalised, and very importantly, is critical of the research enterprise itself. So I've just put two other resources in addition to Linda Smith's seminal work. There's a very nice book called Indigenous Research Methodologies by Bageli Jaliza, and a handbook that was published a few years ago by Denson Lincoln and Linda Smith. And it's very important just to re-emphasize the point that political context often gives impetus to decolonizing methodologies. In our context, there's been so many different political moments, and we continue to and are likely to head into many more different political moments where decolonizing methodologies are likely to be very important. But just reflecting on the past few years, there was the Roads Must Fall, Fees Must Fall, Me Too, the Black Lives Matter, Fridays for the Future continues in relation to climate change. And all of these sort of political background issues come together to give impetus to DM in different ways. Now, at this point, it's very important to say that often when people align to decolonizing methodologies, it's not necessarily that they see this as an overarching or all-encompassing kind of methodological approach. And often there's uncomfortable bedfellows, strange bedfellows that are almost not forced, but come together at particular moments to engage in a particular social issue of the time. And I'll give some examples later. So if you were to ask me and others, what then would be distinctively decolonizing methodologies? What would be the key feature if you are going to align to this broad methodological and political movement? And I've thought long and hard about this because initially when I started giving this talk, I would be evasive. I'd say, well, listen, read X, Y, and Z, think about this, think about that. But I thought, well, actually, let me just pin down what I think are the 10 key pillars, and of course, what others have also seen as the 10 key pillars. Now, there are many more, I think, but I'll just quickly go through them. The first is that they are aligned to critical decolonial or post-colonial thinking. Now, some people are uncomfortable with the term post-colonial because, you know, coloniality in its various guises still kicks around, but generally speaking, they are aligning with some form of decolonial approach. The second is that decolonizing methodologists generally recognize and aim to critique power and power differentials, both within communities, and I'm going to say this time and time again, but also within the academy itself. There's a strong focus on justice, human rights, and equality. In my line of work, there's also a strong focus on climate and climate justice and sustainability, but that you could, I guess, classify under justice. There is generally a closer relationship between researchers and participants from start to finish, where the researchers tend to position themselves as not the extractors of information, but involve communities right from the design of the projects all the way through. Research really does have an emphasis on change and action, not just for research's sake. I've said this before, but there is a strong focus on systems and structures. There is a strong identification with the history and the complexity of history, which is important, and I'll come back to that in a few slides' time. The next one is critical self-reflexivity. Now, we often talk about self-reflexivity, you know, the need for researchers and anyone interested in research to be self-reflexive, but I find that often those reflections are very thin. You know, people, you'll see it in a separate section in a thesis, personal reflexivity, self-reflexivity, where the person talks about their privilege and then moves on to do unreflexive research anyway. But I think critical self-reflexivity does involve a long, deep, hard think about your place in the decolonial project, or just generally whatever you're doing in relation to equality, justice, and so forth. So what is my place in this? And often I hear this, do I even have a place? I hear it so often from students from any imaginable background saying, you know, I'm not sure I belong here. I'm not sure I have a place to talk about a particular issue, about slavery and so forth. So critical self-reflexivity is very important and something close to my heart more recently, and I'll explain why. The ninth key pillar for me is the need to look at new forms of ethics. And again, we've very blessed in South Africa to have researchers doing this work, particularly in psychology, looking at ancestral ways of thinking about the world, about connectedness, about the connectedness between humans and the non-human world, about biodiversity and about community. And it's much of that doesn't reflect in the way we think about ethics, usually in the academy when we're considering proposals and so forth. At a symposium, I think it was in 2018, one of the participants made a very provocative, or asked a very provocative question about how do we incorporate permission from the ancestors in communities when we're doing studies. And it really got a lovely discussion going about what and how we consider ethics to play itself out. The 10th one, of course, is pursuit of autonomy and self-determination. And I think this is very, very important when decolonizing methodologists are doing their research. Really, the recognition and the appreciation and helping communities to achieve in various ways autonomy and self-determination is very important. And I can give you loads and loads of examples, certainly in my field, which is broadly environmental and climate psychology, where people have started to adopt different ways of helping and being allies, and allyship coming through of participants rather than just doing research on participants and leaving. I mentioned earlier my passion recently about focusing on knowing thyself, knowing yourself, and critical reflexivity. And I'm not suggesting everyone should do this, but what quite interesting, I personally have often struggled with the same question that many of you have, and that is, do I have a place in doing this kind of work? What is my place? How do I go about positioning myself? Often in contexts where extreme divisions emerge about who has a right to say what. And so I've, over the past few years, been doing quite a bit of historical research on my own family ancestry, and quite interesting findings too. Remember this guy, Henry Francis Finn, that I spoke about earlier? Well, he's my great-great-great-grandfather. Can you believe it? And that's a bit awkward, isn't it? Being a decolonizing methodologist person who has this family legacy, one of the biggest colonizers, I guess, around. But at the same time, I also have this guy who's King Faku, who's also one of my very more famous ancestors. This guy, Ngikela, also paramount chief of the Pondos. And this guy who was basically liberated from slavery, he's taking a nap and so forth. You'd notice that these are all men too, and that's quite important to point out too. Amongst these more famous resistors of colonization, as well as some of the worst colonizers around, we also have the everyday stories of people. We've got incredible stories of men and women who have resisted colonization. But it's only through this process, I guess, that I've started to really come to terms with where I sit in all of this, and by no means a complete picture. It's by no means a picture that ends with me making a final statement in terms of critical reflexivity, but it certainly has helped me a lot to contextualize why I do what I do and what drives me, etc. So I'm just going to push ahead. If this was a face-to-face discussion, I would have invited comments, but I don't think it's possible. So I'm going to press on and look at then what are the criticisms of decolonizing methodologies. And more importantly, how do we do decolonizing methodologies without reinforcing the system that we aim to critique? So the spirit of this critique is the following, that decolonizing methodologies can be extremely useful for researchers to frame their work in psychology, but also beyond. Like I said earlier, we've got some nice examples of people doing community work, community psychology type work that, you know, I could happily share with you later on or separately. And I think it's a useful way of framing methods. However, we should not assume that certain methodologies are de facto more likely to contribute to decolonization than others. So for me, it's very important, therefore, to interrogate the assumptions of decolonizing methodologies, especially when it becomes a way to, the only way in which we conceptualize research. And I do this, if anything, to make the movement more impactful, not necessarily to undermine it. And if we don't do this, I fear that we're going to run the risk of perpetuating a system of knowledge production that is at best powerless, but at worst continues to produce limited knowledge just under a new guise, where we will have courses on decolonizing methodologies and sell textbooks that are exorbitant, when in fact, you know, people who could benefit from that are excluded from the academy and so forth. So the first criticism I have is, and just to re-emphasize the point that these are not necessarily only me criticizing, several other people have raised these criticisms as well. But the first is its location in paradigms. So, and this bugs me, and many of you who've interacted with me in various ways would know my whole talk about how limited our understanding of paradigms are. And we still are teaching the same table, focusing on epistemological stances. And what's happened over the years is that table on the right-hand side has grown exponentially. In fact, the latest handbook of qualitative methods, I think it was over 30 pages long, if I'm not mistaken. When initially there was positivism, post-positivism, and interpretivism in the 90s when I studied, and there was ontology, epistemology, and methodology. Now both the columns and the rows have expanded a hell of a lot. And many methodologists who want a so-called rightful place for decolonizing methodologies insert themselves into this table to show how it differs and shows how it is positioned in relation to other so-called paradigms. But I find this quite limiting and prescriptive, mainly because it forecloses a sort of meta-critique of the systems that privilege certain knowledges. It also forecloses any discussions of other ways of thinking about paradigms, philosophical paradigms that influence research. And it really does limit us. And each time a new methodological movement, and you'll notice that I'm using that word, methodological movement, comes along, and I'm using that word very deliberately. Each time a movement comes along, we add something more to that table, and it does become quite limiting and prescriptive, because the only way to do decolonizing methodologies then would be to follow these kinds of prescriptive pieces of content in the cells of the table. The second criticism I have is that sometimes we tend to be we tend to be lazy with the concepts we draw on. So when people talk about decolonization, social justice, participation, slavery, apartheid, what exactly do we mean? Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not asking for operational definitions, but many of the concepts we use are very, very complex. They, the mechanics of them were interesting, but also complex. And, we need to interrogate some of these concepts without necessarily just drawing on them as we wish. And one of my best examples is the word decolonization itself. And while it's a powerful word currently, particularly in universities, often remind people that, decolonization was also used by the apartheid government to justify the Bantustan, their homelands. And I've just put a quote there from a book from 1976. We use words like participation and participatory methods, but there's a long, long, long critique about participation. And I've just put one of the earlier books, the cover called Participation, the New Tyranny. I think sometimes when we use these words, it overlooks the contestation, complexity, and negative interpretation. And so I'd encourage all of us, when we draw on concepts that we think are taken for granted, really to just stop and read a bit more deeply, but also read across disciplines about, the complexity of these concepts. Another criticism, again, and I know I'm repeating myself here, but is systems. One thing I'm very, very aware of is the commodification of decolonial work. And again, just try buying the latest decolonial work from your favorite scholar and you'll see what I mean. Of course, scientific publishing makes a fortune of research. Much of it is not equal, and much of it doesn't come back, of course. Robert Maxwell, for example, called academic publishing a perpetual financing machine. And so we often capture academics' resources and labor and then sell it for huge profits. Now, of course, there is an open access movement. There's also a lot and lots of activity going on in terms of making sure that our knowledge is actually reaching the places it should be without having to pay lots of money. But this is something we really need to look at without, of course, I guess someone said to me once at a conference, well, what do you want? Maybe we should just get rid of the whole system to begin with. All universities must go, etc., etc. Of course, I wouldn't necessarily agree with that, but I do think it's something that we need to keep an eye on, and especially as we go into a new era, I guess, of digital futures, where we are thinking through how the systems are actually maintaining the way things are. A colleague, Moira Keane, wrote a very nice article called Decolonising Methodology, Who Benefits from Indigenous Knowledge Research. It was a nice provocative piece in 27, but I'd encourage you to read it, but also to think through that question of who is standing to benefit from the academic side of Indigenous knowledge. The fourth criticism I have is representation. So often in calling attention to plight of marginalized people, decolonizing methodologies tend to reproduce quite racist, sexist, and class representations of those groups. And we see it a lot, certainly in my field, in climate psychology, we see a lot of really uncomfortable representations of marginalized people. And it's really important that people who are engaging with this should take a more respectful and relational approach to research with marginalized people, and sometimes drawing on concepts quite lazily, like indigenous, and even sometimes marginalized, as I have done, leads to unintended, perhaps, representations that are not tend to reinforce these ideas of indigenous people being a particular way. But perhaps a simplification I say here is a necessary evil to show just how untransformed psychological research sometimes is. But we must be careful to not inadvertently reproduce racist and sexist representations. The fifth criticism I have is this idea of choice. Now, often, when it's taught or we speak about it, or when you read about it, you'd imagine that researchers have ultimate choice. in what they tend to do research on, ultimate choice in terms of which methodologies they use. But of course, we know that's not true. Certainly, researchers in the Global South, particularly those doing applied research, are often located in quite complicated, large research teams with funding from the North, and obviously, and in many cases, the studies are designed elsewhere, and we do the work. Often researchers in universities are constrained by elements of the institution itself, ethics, ethics frameworks, funding frameworks, reporting frameworks, and so forth. And importantly, students are often constrained by these. So it's not necessarily true that we could just one day all wake up and say we want to be decolonial scholars. A lot needs to go into making sure that that actually takes place, and often you have to jump through several hoops to enable you to do that. And certainly in my own research, working in applied context, theoretical context, but also in large teams, we often neglected the power imbalances that happen between those perhaps in more privileged positions in the global north and those of us here in the global south. So in terms of future applications, I think decolonizing methodologies as, again, a movement tends to pop up at particular points in time. Certainly over the fees must fall, and the emphasis on decolonizing curriculum and research in many institutions a few years ago. Decolonizing methodologies was front and center. It's kind of been a bit quiet now, but I think it'll pop up again. But I do think that there's certainly a role in psychology and psychological research for framing much of our work in a decolonial manner. There was often quite a simplistic division put forward between an emphasis on decolonial research and, for example, the fourth industrial revolution, saying that they don't speak to each other. But I don't buy that necessarily, because people are, these days, most people's lives are digitally mediated. And of course, we've seen a hell of an increase in digitally mediated research, research that is focusing on social media scrapes, research that's doing all sorts of big data gathering and so forth. But there is also a place, I think, to offer some interpretation there from a decolonial methodology lens, particularly in relation to, for example, how that data is used, where the data goes to, some of the applied algorithms and so forth that we know are inherently biased, and that have bias written into them, sometimes inadvertently, and so forth. There's also, I think, a huge space. I'm interested in climate activism and youth climate activism amongst Black youth, and there's enormous potential. And some of the studies that I've been involved with recently has focused on that, to show that, the digital sphere is one that's wide open, but it's also very important that we don't just leave it like that, but we also bring in a particular lens into looking at how, for example, youth engage in digital youth climate activism. I've touched a little bit on AI, and at the moment, I think a preoccupation is on AI-mediated knowledge production. I don't have strong views, but certainly it has caused quite a stir. And ChatGPT, there's not a day that goes by where there isn't a webinar at the moment. But again, if we are taking seriously the notions that I mentioned earlier, the pillars of decolonizing methodologies, there is an important opportunity there to be able to look at those. And of course, the old publishing houses that continue to make a fortune and will continue in different guises, I know, to make a lot of money, and also just to keep things the way they are. So thank you, colleagues. That's me. I know, and I apologized before that I'm not going to give you a definition, but I'm going to give you a broad overview. I hope I've done that, but I think we have lots of time for questions, hopefully, Chair. And yeah. But maybe just a few more final remarks, that I do think that there is opportunities at particular historical moments to see decolonizing methodologies as a political movement that can actually shake things up whenever we are forgetting about why we are doing research. There's huge opportunity in terms of thinking about paradigms, pedagogy, and assessment. I've mentioned publishing, but most important to be vigilant, not to reinforce the status quo. Now I'm done, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof Barnes. I'm just taking over for Fatima for 2 seconds. I know she's also struggling with internet. I see we have 2 hands up. Maybe let's start with Nsiki.
Thanks, Brandon. I mean, that was really interesting and insightful. So I was not expecting that I would be first. I thought I was second. But the question that I wanted to ask, rather, I would like you to go back, to that question. You did say earlier on that in us now embarking, on all forms of decoloniality, we need to be careful and not reproduce what was in the past. So I would like you to speak more on that, so that, I mean, we are all clear on where we should be taking ourselves. And in fact, I mean, just perhaps to bring myself into the conversation, I'm probably one of the people who realized much later in my life the power of my voice and understanding what that means in research and what I do. And so I've had to be intentional about, the language that I use. So opting for participants instead of subjects or respondents, because I want my participants to bring themselves into the research that I embark on. And so for me, that has been a big revelation. And when I think about decolonization, it's also about considering those voices that have been silenced for the longest time and finding spaces. So in my case, it's students. And so I argue that we as educators need to provide spaces for students to be co-constructors of knowledge, particularly in health sciences, because we know that, we're not talking about a product. We talk about a service and one that is people-centered. And so for students then to be co-constructors of knowledge, it's on the assumption that they're not coming in as empty vessels. They have some knowledge. So it may be knowledge that has been acquired from ancestors. It may be knowledge that has been acquired, from the community or in the spaces that they occupy. And so when we talk about, for instance, ChatGPT and other forms of AI, students may well be ahead of us. And so we need at some point to allow ourselves to be vulnerable and bring them in, so that they contribute, to this new knowledge that we're generating.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. And often they're very willing to do that. And they're looking for opportunities to do that, to get stuck in themselves. So I couldn't agree with you more. Yeah, so, reinforcing the status quo, I think, I could give you many examples, but even the way in which we conceptualize this idea of community, what is a community, how we go in, often people who align themselves to more critical methodologies still are seeing this idea of a community as a homogeneous group of people, usually those who are living in poverty, who live on the outskirts of the mainstream, etc., etc. But again, if we're not careful, then we can fall into the same traps about essentializing, representing the marginalized in particular ways, and so forth. That kind of reinforce what we aim to do. So I can give you many examples, not just of concepts, but also in the way we do our research. that actually, when you stop and think, and I'm guilty of it myself. You know, I'm not at all pretending that I haven't done that. But when I look back, certainly at studies I've done earlier on in my career, I feel quite ashamed, you know, having done it the way I needed to do it like that. But I do often feel that, ugh, it's terrible, or look at earlier writings and think, ugh, that's awful. But for me, the issue is really just being on our toes and being willing to open, like you used the word vulnerable, but be willing to be critical of ourselves and critical of you know, movements, I guess, methodological movements too. I hope I've sort of answered your question or responded to your comments.
Yes, you have.
Thank you.
You have. I mean, you've reflected on your past experiences. I thought that maybe you could speak to how we should move ourselves forward.
Yeah, you know,
how do we look out for those trappings?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think, you know, for me, if we are staying true, you know, I've used the 10 pillars because I felt that that's a cool way to. But if we are constantly looking at those 10 pillars, we could call them values, we could call them whatever you want them, characteristics, and reflecting constantly, you know, am I being true to those? And I think that that's worth it. It's very difficult to say that you should, and you know, I am going to resist saying you should do decolonizing methodologies in a particular way. But if you're being true to those values, or the values that you hold in addition to those, then I think that's a useful way, a useful guide, perhaps. I mean, you know, even work in the digital space, I've ventured into that world myself. But I've still tended to be an outsider. You know, I'm studying what young youth activists, climate activists are doing online. But in many ways, again, I'm falling into this trap of, you know, trying to extract what's happening out there, which is fine. But more recently, I've started moving into actually engaging with those participants and getting them, like you say, to co-construct different programs, co-construct different agendas, and to also help interpret with the findings. Thanks, Nsiki.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thanks, Sal. Sorry for missing your hand earlier. Please go ahead.
Hi, do I need to show my face?
No, not for me.
Okay, and by the way, my name is Noguntu. It's very important, the name to be called, so that you are not being made invisible.
Yes.
Thank you, Prof, for this is something that is in my heart, by the way. And my dean actually sent this very personally for me to attend, because he knows that I'm very passionate, and I ventured into this decolonial methodologies. Prof, there are three things. You mentioned you used thin positionality. And I smiled because I've seen that. It's like I'm just thinking. And then now you actually use the other word. I'm coming to ask you the question here. You said, do I even have a place in that process of positioning oneself? Do I even have a place? Now my question, which is one, comes to this. Do I even have a place as a not Black man who research on Black African virginity and purity? Is that even my place? Two, the ethics committees in the higher education. Do you think, is there a risk if they are not continuously being intentional of being gatekeepers of decolonizing methodologies? By that, I mean, as you said, when you look back in your own writings, you kind of cringe. Is this our right? So there are many people that have been doing the research this way as long as they lived. And now those people are actually in the committees. And I'm not sure, isn't there even there, right there, a risk of being gatekeepers when something that you're not familiar with comes up? And the third one and the last, Prof, I'm also probably also like you with just not use words flippantly. Decolonization. How does that look like? Is that a fair question? Thank you.
Thank you. Those are all very good questions. You would have noticed me smiling because, yeah, they resonate. They definitely resonate. So, the first question, and I'll try go through these relatively quickly. Do I even have a place now? Now that question is a very important question, and it's a question that, as I said in this presentation, I've asked myself a lot. But I've had to turn it to myself because I've often felt that maybe I don't have a place in doing, for example, or making comments about slavery, etc., until I actually went back and looked at the lives of my slave ancestors. And it's shocking, absolutely shocking. But also to engage with that, to think very, very deeply on a personal level about where I sit at this point, how I engage with that, but not just as a flippant, like you said, thin, and like I said, thin description, that often feeds into the idea of, that were created by apartheid. I am a colored man who's doing work on X, Y, and Z, and just leave it at that. But to really, really engage and to help me enrich my historical understanding of how people position themselves. So critical reflexivity for me, it's something I'm very passionate about these days, and encouraging as many people as I can to engage with that question. It doesn't need to be a full-on deep study of your ancestors, etc. It doesn't need to be that, but to really stop and think and ask some very, very, very important questions about your own place, how you and it's not just in terms of your research, but how you interacting with others, how you interacting within your own environments, how you're interacting with your students, how you're teaching, and so forth. So for me, it's been a very deep and powerful process to really engage. And I'm by no means, like I said in my presentation, come to an end of that. But it's a question only we can ask ourselves, And also, when people do perhaps object to a particular person doing work in a particular context, it's very important that we all collectively think about what that might mean and where those kinds of criticisms and bifurcations are coming from, and how different people within those debates can think about how they're doing what they're doing. Okay, so thank you very much, Nobuntu. That was the first one. The ethics committees, ethics committees, and you mentioned gatekeepers, and I think that's an important thing. But I've also been for quite a few years now an academic administrator, and I do also know the difficulties that ethics committees are going through. So the work that they do, the good work that they do. So I think it's incumbent on everyone to work together, I guess, to look at some of how the ethics committees work and the ethical frameworks that we use in universities to, I guess, to govern research, to put it very bluntly. But yeah, certainly many decolonial scholars find that very, very frustrating, extremely frustrating, how different committees, and it's not just also ethics committees, there are other committees that work in universities. So again, I share your frustration, having worked both in an administrative role as well as an academic. I can perhaps locate myself in terms of thinking through how we can make it, better. Yeah, and in terms of I guess defining decolonization, again, very, very difficult. You and I will spend months talking about a definition of decolonization.
Not even defining, Prof.
Yeah.
Do we even see when we see it, this is, can we point? Because my point is coming also from the research committees and all of the other committees. Can they look at this document and see, how does it look like?
I got it. I got it. Absolutely. So, again, to pinpoint in the everyday, I completely agree. Nobuntu, to pinpoint in the everyday how maybe colonial practices are still at play, or how we could be doing it differently, given our view, our very good knowledge often of the decolonial practices. But again, again, I'll encourage each and every one of us to engage with those questions as they come up.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Rizwana.
Hi, Prof. Thank you for a great presentation. So I teach research methods. I'm very into this because, this is something we have to include in our courses in future. And as you speak about it, I'm still wondering, and we come back to this definition, what is it? What are decolonizing methods? And, when you started speaking about it and you spoke about the principles, I thought a lot about this being very similar to participatory based research, participatory action research, that sort of thing. So a lot of the values sort of align there. And then also it's very much linked to qualitative methods. And I thought about, so what space is there for quantitative research in decolonizing methods? Right? And then you spoke a bit about that. You spoke a bit about sort of the purpose of it, like looking at sort of the intentionality and what it's used for. And so I wondered, so are we talking about decolonizing methods, or are we talking about decolonizing research? Because methods in and of themselves can't really be decolonizing, but research as an endeavor sort of as a whole can be. So I wonder if we maybe, maybe instead of thinking about decolonizing methods, look at it more broadly, because I'm thinking, what sort of methods are colonizing then?
Yeah, no, that's great. Thanks, Rizwana. I trust you to give me a difficult question. No, I mean, you spot on in your questioning. Absolutely. So, let me start off with the quantitative. You probably guessed my answer, but there is, in my view, a very important role for quantitative method. In fact, in my field, some of the more radical work that's come out has been quantitative in nature, and yet not necessarily called itself decolonizing methodologies. Some of the quite empirical studies that have come out showing particular environmental impacts, for example, on child development, for me, it's been wonderful. But if you look at the principles that I put forward, or the pillars, you'll see that those are written into that research quite nicely. So for me, it's not so much a quantitative, qualitative, or even, some people would even shudder at us still talking like that. In quantum qual and mixed methods, some methodologists have kind of moved on from the terminology. But for me, it's not just about the methods. It's about everything else that goes in the person who's doing the work, their approach, their values, their principles, how they do it, their approach to the so-called participants or communities they're working with, the approach to ideas of social change, approach to ideas of equality. So it's our entire package, So, and I say this in one of the papers I wrote, where I say, a method itself, and you've said it perhaps more eloquently, a method itself is not going to decolonize anything. And in fact, we just, in many cases, are just rehashing methods over and over and plugging them into different sort of paradigmatic views. That's not going to change much. But when you have an entire package of the researcher, the participants, the approach, the respect, the way the work is disseminated and so forth, then I think you're more on track to making real change. Who knows, decolonizing methodologies might fall away. It does for quite some time, since Linda Smith's work in 1988, I think it's been quite a while. But it does pop up, like I said, over key historical moments. But I do think, regardless of what you're calling a methodology or a method, it's largely to do with how it's packaged and taking it forward. So I think that would be my response to you, and I think that's a great question. Have I covered it?
Yes, thank you very much.
I can't really help you with your course. Thank you.
So in the chat box, we've had some people asking for if the video will be made available. The video will be made available on our YouTube channel as well as the Facebook channel. I have posted the links for both of these platforms in the chat box. And then in addition to that, Prof, people are saying thank you so much for the presentation. It was brilliant. The person says that's a brilliant question about the ethical right to investigate topics, not that's not appropriate to them. And then a great presentation again. So yeah, thank you for the comments. Nobuntu, please check this article on the ResearchGate of the role of higher education institution in facilitating transforming habitus, gender questions. And then, yeah, thank you. So my question would be, I've read about post-methodology or post-qualitative methodology, and how would that fit in with a decolonial framework, Prof?
Yeah, that's a very difficult one, Fatima. I actually haven't engaged much with that, but I have been in the presence of some very good researchers recently who have started speaking about, post methods, and some of them actually in this room. It's not something I know much about, to be honest. But I'd still come back to my earlier assertion that regardless of what we're calling what we're doing, we should be guided by certain principles, values, pillars of research. And I think, that to me is the starting point, regardless of what we eventually call it. But I don't know much about that particular movement. Maybe you could share some ideas, Fatima.
I think, Prof, while Fatima thinks about that, please just
Was
tell
it
us
something I said?
please just tell us again how we can get your book.
My book? No, it's not my book. Sorry, I was making a point.
I'm not quite sure, but when I was listening to that, reading some work on.
Yeah, sorry. This is definitely not my work. I was making a point about how expensive and that we need discounts. It's someone else's book. I wish it was mine.
So I was actually listening to Walter Mignolo talk about methodology, and he was answering a question on how do you actually come up with a methodology, and he was saying, but we should give ourselves the space and time to actually listen to ourselves and develop our own methods. So how would that kind of thought fit in with the decolonial framework?
I think that's a lovely thought. It is a lovely thought, and in some ways it resonates a lot with what I've been saying, in the sense that we shouldn't necessarily be tied to a particular method, especially in calling it that. But that actually the process of research should be underpinned by the principles and characteristics that I mentioned earlier, regardless of what we call it. And in fact, in many cases, we do research and then we call it something afterwards. And it's sad to say, but you would have also heard me speak about similar things. But that's a wonderful way of capturing it, and I think there would be some resonance with what I've been speaking about today.
Okay. So yes, thank you, Prof, for opening up a really wonderful talk to the rest of the presentations that we will have for the year. Just some information to everybody. We will have a webinar on autoethnography, some other webinars. Let me just give me a second to. I was trying to link an article on the group chat, but for some reason I wasn't successful with it. But Prof Barnes has a lovely article in the SAJP which speaks to the decolonizing research methodologies in psychology. So for the rest of the year, we have lovely presentations on academic writing, autoethnography, photo voice, which Santosh and Stephanie Lynn will be doing. Prof Ali will do autoethnography, and then we have Congress in October, and then Dr. Kutsia will kick us off with critical theory in health psychology. So we have quite an impactful list of webinars that will be presented through the course of the year, and we hope that you can distribute the webinar invitations moving forward. And to Prof Barnes, Prof, as always, thank you so much for the thought-provoking and interesting webinar and discussion, and we look forward to engaging with you in the future.
Yeah, thank you.
If these, I don't see any other questions in the chat box except thank you. There's a question, how do we get the book? I think you answered and said that
I did
you,
answer.
it's
Yeah,
not,
it's not in my book, and it was on 20% special, and I was trying to make a point, maybe not so effectively, that these books are often so expensive that we need a discount to be able to buy them.
I was attracted, Prof, with
Yeah,
20% off.
I tell you what, when I do write a book, I'll give you 20% off.
What about free?
Sounds good.
Yeah, we'll make it free.
With
It has to be free. Yeah? Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
If you could make it free, that would be great.
Yeah, that's better. That's better. Yeah.
So to everybody who joined us today, and to Prof Barnes, thank you everybody. To all the DRM members that joined as well, thank you so much. It was lovely engaging with everybody. Have a great day further. Bye-bye.
Bye.